welcome to Daily Debrief from People's Dispatch. I'm Pragya, and today in our first story, the Supreme Court in the Philippines has refused to strike down a draconian anti-terrorism law. American billionaire Elon Musk is now set to take over Twitter, and a SIPRI report finds war expenses are higher than ever. On 7 December last year, the Philippines Supreme Court refused to strike down a stringent anti-terrorism law. Now it has turned down appeals against that ruling. There have been widespread attacks on civil liberties in the Philippines. Thousands are said to be in prison or subjected to torture and other forms of abuse by the state. There have been extrajudicial killings and disappearances of political dissidents. Last year, the court removed parts of the law allowing that they affected freedom of expression and the right to protest, but rights activists say the law as a whole has a chilling effect on democratic rights and they want it declared unconstitutional. 37 petitions challenged the December ruling, but the court has said they could not raise substantial issues and arguments. Anish from People's Dispatch will explain more. Anish, what is the problem with this law?
Well, one of the main things that they raised contentions was about how the ATA can actually just term anybody a terrorist. Now, this is a very wide-ranging power, and even the term terrorist has its own political implications that, in most countries and most governments don't really try to define. Even here, we don't have a proper definition of what a terrorist is as opposed to an insurgent or other terms that the Filipino government makes use of it, and it deals with all sorts of militants. But in this case, a terrorist can be anybody from somebody who is, like, say, speaks in support or propagandizes for a banned group to somebody who's actively involved in acts of violence against the state. So this is something, this kind of wide-ranging powers is one thing that was always talked about. Secondly, there is, detention without warrant for an extended period, and it can be for weeks, even months, even with a warrant, and the warrant doesn't necessarily have to go through the same kind of judicial rigor that other sorts of arrests have to go through. And finally, there is it takes out what previously existed in previous legal setups, which was reparations for being falsely charged. Now, this means that the authorities can actually just charge anybody without thinking of consequences against them, which earlier used to exist in the Philippines, but now we will be seeing that does not exist anymore. There will be no kind of damages given to political activists who might be falsely accused, even accused of being terrorist or being associated with terror groups. And so in these cases, as you pointed out, these are giving out, like, it can have a chilling effect on not only political political freedoms and civil liberties, but also just like basic free speech in the country. And you can even be charged over a mild suspicion because you said something about the government's policy or you said something about any of the insurgents, and that can actually land you in a long-term judicial process that that is undermined and rigged in many ways against you. So even if you do not get eventually arrested and sentenced to prison for being a terrorist or whatever, you would still have to go through this sort of like a prolonged judicial persecution. And it's not really the judicial process that is happening. It's a special body that will be appointed by the government. So the ruling government pretty much has a say on who is going to be deemed as a terrorist or the enemy against the state.
So, Anish, there's also an election due in Philippines on 9th May. So does that frame the context in which the court verdict has come and the context of the law itself?
So yeah, so obviously the law itself has its own, it can be said contextualized with the election, because it came under the Duterte government, but obviously he will not be standing for re-election. But there is this Marcos campaign that is going on in alliance with Duterte's daughter, Sara Duterte, and they have always been very supportive of such a wide, sweeping law that actually gives the executive a great deal of powers. So, and they are kind of like the front runners in the election with across all opinion polls. So, obviously, the dangers of it is going to be long term. We also have a situation where most of the other candidates have also taken a very piecemeal stand on the matter. Many of them have not given out their stand on the law very explicitly or very clearly, except for very rarely, like you have Robredo having a stand, and then others not really very clear of where they where they want to stand on, and if they would actually repeal it once they are in power. Nevertheless, in the long-term basis, as another government comes in, that can be whether or not it's a populist right-wing government, it would still have this kind of overarching powers that really just threaten civil liberties in the country. Under Duterte, we have already seen a widespread a violation of human rights and liberties, a targeting of activists, and very often extrajudicial killings that began with governments targeting them as associates of the banned Communist Party or as front groups of the party, and then being killed or maimed by vigilantes and other pro-government groups that may not be associated with the police. So very often, even if if the law doesn't get you, there are these vigilante groups that will obviously get you. So it is kind of like the chilling effect goes beyond the law as well. Throughout the civil society, it vitiates that atmosphere where the civil society can actively function. And this is something that is in the mind of all rights organization, progressive movements who have opposed it very strongly. And we have to remember, Philippines is very recently turned into a democracy. It was in the 80s that it could actually become a proper democracy. Until then, it was under a very authoritarian rule under Marcos Jr.'s own father, one of the candidates' own father, who was very rightfully called the dictator of that country for nearly 2 decades. And his regime was marked with all the same kind of violations that the executive really now wants to take back, the powers that the executive is trying to bring itself under. So this is the sort of situation that Philippines is currently heading
All
to.
right, Anish, thanks a lot. So we'll be back with you in just another minute. On Monday, the board of directors of Twitter approved a $44 billion pitch from Elon Musk to buy the social media giant. The American billionaire owner of Tesla has said Twitter will go private. Musk has also said that once he controls Twitter, it will have more free speech. Some say it could mean former US President Donald Trump will get his suspended Twitter account back. Others say, based on Musk's track record, that he will not allow dissent at all on the platform and that there could be more hate speech, disinformation at the very least. We'll go back to Anish from People's Dispatch for an update on this. So, Anish, who's happy with this deal? It sounds like there are billionaires fighting over Twitter and one of them wins every time.
Yeah, I mean, it is pretty much a war between oligarchs in many ways. But the people who are currently quite happy about it is the right wing, and not just in the US, but around the world. We have seen a certain level of jubilation on their part, because one of the things that Musk is trying to promise through this takeover is that the restrictions on all this hate speech or any kind of attack on vulnerable groups or minorities will be taken out or will not be taken that seriously. And this only emboldens the right, because he comes from that. He's obviously seen as this icon of the right, in the Americas and in the West in general. He has very clearly sided with the alt-right movements, and not just alt-right, but also like even explicitly right-wing movements, and have supported them, have supported many of their activities, and even their attacks on a lot of vulnerable groups. And so, in that case, his takeover is kind of going to embolden the right wing, and that will in turn have a significant impact. So, whether or not he actually follows through with the question of doing away with internal regulations of community, or those community guidelines that Twitter very often bandied about, is going to not be much of an effect, because the right wing groups, those who we fear are like the ones who spread hate speech against minorities, against sexual minorities, women, and or troll them, abuse them online, they will be completely emboldened to do whatever they want to. And that is where the fears lie for many in the progressive community. But at the same time, we have to remember that the manner in which Twitter used to censor these groups was also very selective. Obviously, Trump was taken out, but at the same time, you had a host of characters in the right wing being given complete lenience, and
Right.
even completely overlooking a lot of extremely vicious statements and tweets and posts by these people, fake news proliferating on Twitter. In fact, it is one of those social media platforms that has been accused of helping such fake news to proliferate. At the same time, it has actually taken a very selective attack on a lot of progressive movements in many ways, cutting down on people, and obviously anti-imperialist of late. We have seen, for instance, during the Russia-Ukraine war, how Twitter has taken a very partisan stand and actually just cut down on any kind of criticism of the Ukrainian government or criticism of NATO, allowed for hate speeches against Russians, and even calls for killing Russians off as acceptable
Right.
in the Twitterverse. So this is the sort of history that obviously Twitter had, and obviously people were completely sick of that. But at the same time, what Musk is offering is not going to be any better in that respect.
So there's obviously no doubt that Twitter has become a mega media company. But now we have a situation where Twitter can actually control narratives on a national basis, etc. So when it becomes privately owned, will will things be any different?
Um, it remains to be seen how different things are going to be. As I said, like obviously his takeover is going to embolden a certain section, but at the same time, on a day-to-day basis, how it will affect our algorithms, how it will affect our views, the kind of access to information that we have, it remains to be seen. We don't really know how it, because he is obviously giving us a lot of promises, which we are not very sure how it will be enacted or affected. But at the same time, for most people, it's not going to make much of a difference on a day-to-day basis, because obviously Twitter, apart from also as a source of access to information, is also just another one of the social media platforms where you build echo chambers, where you build your own circles and networks. So it remains to be seen how that is going to work around. Obviously, Twitter's algorithms are quite different from what YouTube and Facebook has, and obviously we have a more wide variety of access to a whole host of information and tweets and posts and everything. But it's something that uh, remains to be seen how that will change. But as you pointed out, the monopoly of it is quite different, obviously, because from like a group of oligarchs controlling media of different sorts, we are going to a stage where single individuals are coming to control entire media houses. And this is a long-term process, as somebody has pointed out, because even before the big media, the big tech uh, coming into this social media space or the media space altogether and becoming, one of the primary sources for information for most people. We had media houses being taken over by single persons. Like the whole Murdoch thing that we had for now years now is being investigated in several countries like Australia about the kind of monopoly it has and the kind of narrative it sets. It's already happening with the traditional media spaces. And now this is something that we are seeing in more the newer big tech media spaces. So social media is also going through that, and it is obviously problematic in the long run because we are going to go to a point where individuals are going to now dictate how things will run. Whether or not they are going to support free speech and like no censorship is a different thing. It is still on their under their discretion how things are, and this is going to be border, national.
Right.
It is going to go across countries, and government regulations may or may not hamper these kind of views and control over media. That also those are also something that we need to keep a watch on. But yeah, we're going through that phase of monopoly where individuals are going to have far more control.
Thanks, Anish. Something to keep a watch on. Military spending was never higher in the world than today. Once again, the United States is miles ahead of everybody else in military expenditure. SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, has reported global arms expenses crossed $2 trillion. This is the seventh straight year of rising military expenditure. The report says the US spent $801 billion, far higher than China, India, Russia, Germany, Iran, and several other countries put together. We'll talk to Abdul from People's Dispatch to try and explain what the trends in spending mean. So Abdul, another report, another year, and the US is leading military expenditure by far. We know this happens every time, but could you try and tell us what the reasons for this are? Why?
US is a kind of global hegemon. It wants to maintain its hegemony, and it has it has the largest military expenditure in the world. The 800 billion is basically, if you club the rest of the next 21 countries together, they will not match that defense expenditure. So it has traditionally has the largest defense expenditure in the world, and this time nothing new. The only thing is, if you in the context of what is happening in Ukraine, if you see out of the 10 most the top most spenders on the defense, you see 7 countries are either NATO members or close US allies, traditional close allies. And if you club them all together, the total defense expenditure crosses half the mark of the total global expenditure on defense. As SIPRI says that this year in 2021, the total defense expenditure was $2.1 trillion. Out of this, 1.1 trillion, $1.15 trillion are spent by these 7 countries, which includes US, UK, South Korea, Japan, and of course the NATO members in Europe, France, and Germany. So and Saudi Arabia. So it shows that basically the US wants to maintain its global hegemony, and that's why in a year which has other problems in its economy, it basically, instead of kind of reducing, in a year which also saw the end of the Afghan war, the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan, despite all those things, despite Biden's promises during election campaign that they will reduce the defense expenditure, this is increasing instead of going down. So even this year's budget proposals, defense budget proposals, are higher than what was there last year. So that shows basically the need of the global hegemony.
Abdul, this was also a COVID year. Isn't it a little too surprising to see that the priorities remain the same despite mass hardship due to the virus?
I think it is not surprising. It is shameful, in fact. It's not surprising. US itself faced a major economic crisis. The unemployment rose to historic highs. There were people who did not get enough food because of they could not work, and so on and so forth. In the world's most developed country, the richest country on the earth. Despite that, the defense was kept as priority. And it is not true only about United States of America. It is true about most of the countries in the world. You see a small country, relatively small country called Nigeria in Africa, increase its budget by more than 56%, which is staggering to say the least. And at the time when the COVID has destroyed the Nigerian economy, and the overall African economies are suffering. In India, for example, where we have seen what has happened in last year, people did not have oxygen cylinders, they did not have enough beds in the hospital. In that year, government found enough money to not only maintain the existing defense budget, but to top it up by more than 1%, around 1%. So it shows that the governments around the world have this kind of skewed priority, where instead of saving the lives of the people, providing them the basic amenities, they tend to spend on something like defense, which most of the time is not a real concern as well. This basically shows the dominance of the war industry in all the respective countries, including the United States, Europe, and in countries like India, where the private and military forces which see war as industry basically pushes the governments to spend more, even if there are crises bigger which need more attention.
All right, Abdul, thank you very much for that. And that is all we have today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. Do come back to us tomorrow, and please follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And for more stories and updates from around the world, read www.peoplesdispatch.org.